thank you all for being here. I know you've all got a lot to do, and there's a lot of places you could go, you could be, and I also want to thank Rick Griffin for being here, and I know Dave Eisler, President Dave Eisler, stopped by, and he's right here. Thank you. And I want to congratulate you on your hockey team. What a tremendous show. The positive national exposure that Ferris State University got from that experience and the commitment that the teammates made is just really incredible. A lot of good stories in the press. I hope, I know all of you have probably been living it, but it was really exciting for me to be able to read about it and see them on TV when they were playing in the Frozen Four. Well, thank you for having me here. It's great to be back on campus. And you know, Dick asked me to come and sort of talk about sort of what's going on and will anything happen between now and the end of the year. A lot of people think that because this is an election year, nothing will take place. And you know, I'm just here to say that sometimes election years, things do happen. Important things happen. And I think back to 1996 when I was working very hard on welfare reform. And it was controversial, as all changes are. And there was a Democrat president and a Republican Congress. And welfare reform was something we'd worked on for several years, and it was really about trying to end the cycle of dependency, which has happened. If you even look at this recession, the number of people on welfare has declined by 58%, even including this recession. So it's been very successful in moving people to independence. And President Clinton had vetoed it twice, but did ultimately sign that bill. So I do think, as discouraging as it might seem, that, gee, nothing's going to get done, everything's on autopilot until the election happens. I look back to 1996, there had been 2 shutdowns of the federal government over budget impasses at that time, late 1995. And yet, by the end of the year, 8 months later, there was the most significant bipartisan social reform of the last 30 years occurred. So even with, I think, some pretty strong disagreements about the direction the country ought to have taken in the 90s, there were opportunities there. And we also are having significant discussions about the budget now. Obviously, with the debt as high as it is at $15 trillion and the dramatic ramp up in that, it's a big concern. But the issue I'm really trying to work on, which I think is important to work on, is fundamental tax reform. And the reason is our unemployment is still not where it needs to be. Michigan's, I just saw a press statement, it's 8.8%. First time it's below 9 in years for our state. Nationally, we're at about 8.2. That's a slight drop. If you look at the number of people who have stopped looking for work and have dropped out of the workforce, it's 14.8%. So there's several calculations that the government makes on unemployment. One doesn't count people who've dropped out of the workforce, another does. So we still have a lot of work to do there. The economy is not where it needs to be, and if you look at polls, people think that there was just one in the New York Times today. People don't feel that we've had a recovery because we haven't. So one of the things that fundamental tax reform could do could help economic growth. And the reason is that we have a tax code that is too complicated. There have been more than 5,000 changes to the code in the last decade alone. That's a lot. It takes a lot of time to comply. The other problem that we have is we're facing this huge uncertainty. At the end of the year, we have a lot of expiring provisions, all of the income, capital gains, estate tax. And so as a result of this uncertainty, you have a lot of people hedging their bets. If they're an employer, they're reluctant to make that decision to build that facility or to hire that person because they're concerned about what their obligations are going to be at the end of the year. If we don't do anything, we'll have a $4 trillion tax increase with all of the changes that are, all the expiring provisions that are going to take place. It's a $4 trillion tax increase, which would take the level of take of the federal government out of the economy, the highest it's ever been in the history of our country. So I think most people believe that there will be some extensions, but how do we get to that and what is it going to be? Well, I think we should go one step further, and let's take this opportunity to reform our tax code and change it in a way that is revenue neutral, doesn't raise money, doesn't lower the amount of money coming in, but does it in a way that lowers rates by closing off some of these loopholes and provisions. Now, some of them are really good things, and they may not all be ended. In fact, I have suggested we get to a 25% rate for both businesses and individuals as the top rate. And as of April 1st, we became the highest business tax country in the world because other countries have been lowering their business taxes. And one of the reasons that you want to have a competitive tax system is because capital's mobile and it can go anywhere in the world, and we don't want all the investment to be in other countries. We want the investment here with facilities, with buildings, and with the jobs that follow. So part of the reason I think tax reform is important is not only do we have expiring provisions, not only has it become complicated, but there's this big amount of uncertainty out there because of the ending of a lot of the tax provisions that have been put in place. And I believe if we can do that, in fact, we had an outline of this in our budget last year, and it was projected to increase jobs by 1 million jobs in the first year alone. And I believe that if we can simplify our code and we can lower rates and also make it fairer, because what it would mean is then just because you don't do exactly what the government asks you to do, you get a special rate. But you'd have a more transparent, more constant effective tax rate, regardless of what particular activities you decided to engage in. The President's gone the other direction. In his State of the Union, he asked for a special manufacturing tax credit, which I think is the wrong direction. It further complicates our code. More businesses will try to become manufacturing defined. They'll hire lawyers and lobbyists to see if they can comply with one of those provisions. I'd like to see us try to find a way to simplify that. There's been some engagement with the administration on that. I've certainly had meetings with the Secretary of the Treasury. They've expressed some interest in business tax reform only. The President has released a framework with some of his policies. I think it's a toe in the water. I'd like to obviously see more, but I'm certainly grateful that at least they're moving forward and trying to engage at least at some level on that. So I think that's very important for our economic growth and our ability to try to get this economy moving again. And I think if we can address the issue of tax reform, I think it's an opportunity for us. I've often said the tax code is 10 times the size of the Bible with none of the good news. And it is a very complex instrument. The other area that we're not competitive is in our international tax system. And I released a proposed piece of legislation last October on that. There's a couple things that occur there. One, we are the only country in the world virtually left that uses what's called a worldwide system of taxation, so that our companies that are US-based, that do business around the world, are double taxed if they try to bring their profits back to the US. Other countries don't do that. So we need to find a way that we can bring that investment back. They estimate there's about $1 trillion overseas from US companies that they're holding over there because they don't want to pay that extra tax to bring it back here. So we want to have, if that money sits over there, it will eventually be invested there. And then that's where the buildings will be. That's where the workers will be working. And we want to make it easier for them to bring that money back to the US and invest it here. I think that's an important part of changing some of our business taxes. So on both the individual side, and the reason why I think it's important to do the individual side and the business side, most businesses now are not what they call C corporations. They're pass-through entities. So those are businesses, but you file as an individual. So if you just did business tax reform, as the President wants to do, or corporate, you would not impact, you would impact less than half of the business economy, because most of the business economy is organized as pass-through entities. And the reason simplification is so important is most of those pass-through entities are small businesses. And it's going to be small business that leads the way in terms of hiring again, because there are so many more of those than there are large companies. But every large company started off as a small company. So you also want to be able to have the kind of economy that will allow those small, sometimes 1 and 2 person, family owned, then they grow, those companies to do better. We recently passed, in an interim way, a 20% tax deduction for, quote, small businesses defined at the federal level, which is, in my mind, fairly large, 500 employees or less. And that's really an interim step. I think that is the kind of thing that, well, that was passed on committee. That's good. I think a more fundamental approach of lowering rates, simplifying the code, having fewer provisions, some call them deductions, others loopholes, however you want to describe it, having fewer of those, I think is the way to go. So that's what I'm trying to work on primarily. And obviously there's other areas that I've been very active in. I thought it was very important that we pass the 3 pending trade agreements that have been pending for more than 4 years, both with Korea, Panama, and Colombia. We had large bipartisan votes. The president signed all 3 of those agreements. I think they waited far too long to do that because what was happening is other countries, the European Union, were taking our template or our model for these agreements, adopting them and implementing them faster than we were. And where we really lost market share in agriculture was in Colombia, particularly in wheat. We saw our ability to have market share decline because they were going to other countries where they were able to negotiate trade agreements with. And also, there's a key ally aspect to that. Certainly Colombia, they're on the UN Security Council. We need to make sure they remain an ally. We also need to have a toehold in Asia other than in China. That's why Korea becomes so important. Obviously, Panama is strategic for obvious reasons with the Panama Canal. But those were key things that needed to happen. I'm glad they did happen, and they happened in a bipartisan way. We often hear that everybody's at, in opposite corners of the room. But when those votes came, there were pretty significant Republican and Democrat votes because it was the right thing for this country, and I was glad that I could be helpful and be one of the leaders to make sure that that happened.